What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Unreal Engine audio tutorial. And today we're going to be taking a look at building a jukebox system inside Unreal Engine 5. Now, some of you may be going, sound effects guy, didn't we already cover this in Unreal Engine 4? Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And it still works. So if you want to follow that tutorial inside Unreal Engine 5, you absolutely can. But there are a lot of you who are just insistent to use MetaSounds for everything. So that's what we're going to be diving into. We're going to be looking at how to set up that in-game jukebox system using MetaSounds. So if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. And if you'd like to be a part of the Sound Effects Guy Discord server, you will find a link in the description below. So with that being said, let's get started. So before we dive into actually building out this jukebox, let's take a listen to it in action. So the way that I have this set up is I've got our MetaSound playing our different music tracks, and I have a switcher set to go forward and backwards through the tracks on the 6 and 4 keys respectively. And then I've also got a P key set up to pause and unpause the track. So as we play, up here in the top left, you'll see that I have print string set up so that we can see what track number that we're on. So I'll go ahead and hit play here. And you can see that we start out on track 0, and I'll explain that in just a second. As we go forward, I'm hitting the 6 key on my numpad, and we can cycle through each of these songs, and then we can also cycle backwards. I also have this set up so that when we get back to the beginning of the list, if we hit previous again, it will loop back to the top of the list, and then vice versa. If we get to the top of the list and press forward again, we're going to loop back to the beginning of that list. And as I mentioned, I have a P key set up to pause and unpause that track. All right, so I'm here in a music folder that I have set up in our content browser, and you can see that we have 5 music tracks. So what we need to start with doing is creating our MetaSound. And I'm just going to call this Jukebox. And we'll go ahead and open this up. And because we're dealing with music, I am going to make this a stereo MetaSound. Now, like always, we need something that's going to play our audio, so we need a wave player. And we can go ahead and select our outputs here. And I'm not just going to tie this on play to our play node. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up an index for our tracks. So I'm going to go ahead and call this track list. We do need to make it an array because we're putting multiple elements in it, and those elements are wave assets. We'll go ahead and set that up. And as I mentioned, I have 5 of them. So now I just need to put those elements in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab them in alphabetical order. You can set these to whatever order you want. It's just easiest. Grab them in order for this example. And so now we have all 5 of our elements inside that array. Now, as I mentioned when I was showing off how this works, we did start with index 0. And this is why, if you see over here on the left, when we're working with arrays, the indexes always start with 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4, instead of starting with 1. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and right click here and get our track list. And you can tell it's an array by the little 8 square grid there. We're going to pull off that and we're going to do a get. And we can tie that into our wave asset. So now our wave player is looking at an array instead of one single asset. From here, I'm going to create another input, and I'm going to call this switch, because this is the input that we're going to use to trigger switching between tracks. Go ahead and get switch. And I'm going to keep the on play because we do also want this jukebox to start when we load the level. So because we're using multiple triggers to play this, we need to use a trigger any. And since I only have 2, we'll use the trigger any 2, but you can actually have up to 8 different triggers that all trigger the same MetaSound. But you can't tie them to the play directly. So like if I were to hit this on play and then use our switch, you'll see that it overtakes it. So we do need to do the trigger any. And this way we can essentially tie them all together here. And we're also going to run this trigger to our get. Now with the way this is currently set up, every time it triggers, because our index is always looking at index number 0, it'll only ever play this first track. We'll never be able to switch through these. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull off this index, and we can promote that to a graph input. And we can see that it's an integer 32. And we can rename this. And I'm just going to call this select. Again, you can name it whatever you want, but it is important to note whatever you name it because we're going to be calling that here in just a little bit. And we're going to leave the default value set to 0, and we're going to be changing this number using the level blueprint. So we'll go ahead and save this, and we can close out of that. And now we need to jump into our level blueprint. So to kick things off, because we are going to load this on our level load, we're going to do an event begin play. And we can just go ahead and drag in our MetaSound here. And if we compile this and save it, it will start out playing that first track, but we don't have any control over it. So what we're going to do is we need to set up a little bit of logic in the fact that we can't just set up a trigger to trigger this to get the next track. We need to set up some sort of logic to trigger this index number to change. Because as I mentioned, we started with a default value of 0, but we need to do a little math to add to it and set that index to get whatever track we want. So because we're going to be manipulating integer values, we do need to set up a variable. We need to change this to an integer. And because I had named this select here, I am just going to go ahead and name it the same over here, just so I can keep everything in order. And we're going to start by getting our index or our integer here. And you can see that by default, this is set to 0 as well. So because I'm going to be using the 6 and 4 keys on my numpad, let's go ahead and set up those inputs. And we need to set up the math that these inputs are going to control. So for moving forward through our index, we're going to go ahead and add. And we're going to set this to just add 1. And we're going to tell this to now set the index to the new number. So we're getting our variable, we're adding 1 to it, and then we're setting it to that new number, which in this case, going from 0, we add 1, now we're at 1. And we're going to set up the same logic here for our for key, except instead of for adding, we're going to subtract 1. And we can go ahead and copy this set. And so now we have the base for our logic for our 6 and 4 keys. So if we come back up here to our audio component, which is our MetaSound, we're going to go ahead and get our parameter interface, which is how we get into the inputs of our jukebox. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to tell it what track to play. So off here, we're going to go ahead and set our integer. And because I named this select in our MetaSound, I also need to, under name here, call this select. Because if they don't have the same names, they're not going to be able to communicate with each other. Now, I do need to copy this out a second time. Because if we were to run this value up and then try to run this value up, it's going to overtake it. So we need these to be separate. And we need to make sure that this integer select knows that we're getting our parameter interface from here. And what we could do from here is, I'll go ahead and move this up a little bit, is I could go ahead and tie this directly to here. And then I can also pull off of our interface here again, and we're going to get a trigger. And because we called this input switch, I'll call this switch and connect these. And so technically this setup will allow us to switch between tracks, but I'll show you by using a print string here why we're not finished with this. So just for the sake of doing this, I'm going to do an event tick. And we're going to get our integer index here. So because I have this running on an event tick, you're going to see a whole string of numbers, but it's not really going to matter too much. We'll go ahead and compile this. And if I hit play, you'll see that we do start out with index 0. And as I hit my 6 key, we're going to head up towards the end of the list. And 4 is the last track in our index. But the problem is, if I keep going, you're going to hear that it's just playing that last track in the index over and over again, and that our index value just keeps going up and up and up. Now, if I go backwards, once we finally get back in the range of our index, you'll hear that it starts selecting those tracks again. But once we get to the beginning of our list, you're going to see that we run into the same problem on the other side. So what we need to do is, I'm going to go ahead and move this event tick out of the way. We're just going to keep this here though, just for some debugging. But what we need to do is we need to set up some logic that is telling our index that, hey, anything over 4, we need to loop back to the beginning of the list. So I'm going to drag this over a little bit because we cannot connect these directly to these set integers. We need to do a sequence here real quick. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that down. Because what we first need it to do, the setting the integer, this is actually going to be second on our list. The first thing that we need to do is we need to run some check logic to see where we're at in that list, in this integer list that we've created. So what I'm going to do is, since we're going to start with our 6 key here, since we're moving up, we know that 4 is the last track in our index. And we can see that here by looking at our array inside our MetaSound. Number 4 is the last one. So anything over 4, and we can just use an equals here. We're going to go ahead and pull off here. And we're going to say if this equals 5, then we want to do something. We're going to go ahead and branch. We can connect this here. And so what we want it to do is, if this equals 5, we want to set this back to 0. So now the way we have this set up, we're hitting 6, we're going up and up and up because we're adding 1. And as we get to the top of the list, once this equals 5, and because we have this sequence set to do this first, it's going to set it to 0, then it's going to trigger that track. And then we can just do the same thing for our 4 key with the same logic on the bottom end. So I'm going to go ahead and pull off here, and we're going to do another equals. And this time, since we're going down, and you saw when I had the print string on the side of the screen, when we went backwards from 0, it did go to -1. I'm going to go ahead and put -1 here. And then we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to bring this out to a branch. And we want this to do this first before it actually plays the track. And we're going to set our integer to the number 4. And this will cause our list to then loop around. So go ahead and compile this. If we move it out of the way, you can see that we're starting again with index 0. And as we hit the top of our list with index number 4, if we hit up one more time, it's setting it to 0, and vice versa. So the last thing that we need to do, because this is completely set up now, this is ready to go. And you can also put this inside a blueprint actor if you want. That way you can carry it over between levels. I just did it in the level sequence, or the level blueprint, because it was the easiest. But really the last thing that we need to do is clean this up, because I don't know if you're like me, I have a really bad habit of just leaving wires all over the place. So let's go ahead and clean this up. And so even though we still have some lines crossing, you can see that this looks just a lot cleaner. All right, guys, so that is going to wrap this tutorial up. Again, the Jukebox tutorial that I created for Unreal Engine 4 using like the media player and making playlists, that does still work in Unreal Engine 5. But you know, like I said, I wanted to cover creating this in MetaSounds as well. So as always, if there's anything else that you would like to see me cover, please let me know by dropping a comment down below, or you can get a hold of me on the Sound Effects Guy Discord server. Until next time.